Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our online technology mixer event. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. My name is Tammy Cho, and I am the Director of Marketing and Customer Advocacy at VistaVu Solutions. Our topic today is around moving towards digital resilience, why becoming digital involves much more than just technology. Joining us for our fireside chat today, we have Sean Murphy, who is MNP's National Digital Leader and a partner in their Consulting and Technology Solutions practice in Ottawa, Canada. Drawing on more than 25 years of business solution implementation experience, Sean helps clients architect and implement strategic change and digital transformation initiatives across multiple industries. We also have our host, Tony B., who is the VP of Consulting and Growth at VistaVu Solutions. He has over 30 years of experience working with companies around the world, advising them on business transformation and how to gain value from technology investments. Tony helps clients connect disconnected things to achieve success in their digital evolution. Welcome both.
Thanks, Tammy.
Yeah, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Tammy. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining our online mixer. Just a couple of little things. You would have received or will be receiving a cup, a VistaVu tumbler, along with some other goodies in an online kit. If you have not received that just yet, it is definitely on the way. It just may have been delayed through customs or some other scenario, or at the time that you registered. We will, over the course of this online mixer, be using the word resilience numerous times, and as a little bit of fun this afternoon, as you hear the word resilience, we'd ask you to all just take a drink from your tumbler. Hopefully you're drinking something interesting wherever you are, so we look forward to that. With that, I'll turn it over to Sean, who will share some of his thoughts with us. Yeah, Sean.
Terrific. Thanks, Tony, and welcome everybody. Good afternoon and good evening. One of the I guess key things that as Tony and I have talked about, I guess, in preparing for today's session, was this whole notion of digital transformation, and I think in a lot of ways we talk about the fatigue around it. So as a key title, or a title for us to start thinking about and using as a form of a discussion today, we thought moving towards digital resilience, and there's our first cue. So why becoming digital involves a lot more than technology. So I promised to take you through a bit of a journey of what that means in terms of the context, and what some case studies in terms of how some organizations have, taken on the challenge of the mantle of digital transformation, and use that as an opportunity for us to maybe capture some of those lessons learned and apply them to the work that we have underway today. So too often, and I think this is somewhat of a facetious comment, but when we start thinking about digital transformation, particularly over the last 14 months, what has been the key, driver of that moving forward? And too often, I think we're seeing, COVID-19 being the key requirement there, rather than more of the disruptor in our midst, as opposed to some kind of internal leadership perspective. So I think that starts to become really the journey that I think many organizations have been on, and many companies certainly over the last 14 months. So what does COVID-19 mean to all of us? And I think and as I talked about it being a key disruptor, and one of the key aspects is not only has it been a factor around our business and what that means in the context of overall business continuity and resilience, but in essence, it's driven many new initiatives just because we've had to. And I think some of the examples coming up from that, particularly over the last, examples that we've seen over the last 14 months or so, has been just dramatic change and transformation across multiple industries. Whether we're talking about, even the mechanisms we're using today, like GoToWebinar or Zoom, but we've certainly seen many more activities take place, whether it's in a retail environment and looking at curbside pickup activities, whether we're having folks at the door actually measuring temperature, whether it's at retail locations or airports or what have you. But we've certainly seen the takeoff of what that means from a logistics perspective with Amazon and others, We've seen it in manufacturing with the inclusion of more PPE, and certainly what that means from a plexiglass and how do we keep people separated in a sort of context. Sports has changed dramatically, and the list goes on, including the new, really new types of applications, including robot lawyers and insurance by the hour. So we've seen a dramatic change over the last, certainly over this last year. And certainly that's certainly affected a great deal of where we are today and where we're going tomorrow. So the real factor here now is, it's no longer about, do we need to transform or do we transform in general, but how do we survive it? And I think that starts to open up a number of key perspectives for us as we start to move forward. And with that whole concept of being digital resilient. And so oftentimes I think we would have approached even a pandemic as a brutal activity in terms of how do we start to consider that in the context of business resilience, and how do we respond and continue business operations in a timely way. Well, and you start to take that same context and concept and make it move forward around digital resiliency. And so the aspect here is really adapting. So not just worrying about continuity here, but actually using this opportunity to adapt. And I think we've seen that particularly in some of the examples I've just shared, but really how do we start to capitalize on these changed conditions and look to take advantage of those moving forward. So I think if I were to ask this question, and certainly I think what we've seen from many organizations and a lot of my clients is, what's changed in your business, certainly over the, I would say even pre-COVID, but now into COVID, and for some of us moving post-COVID, is what's really changed. And a lot of that is, well, pace has obviously been a key aspect of that. And I would say this is true across multiple industries. We're just moving a lot quicker. Decision making needs to be quicker. We're having to adapt and make changes to businesses on a almost daily basis. And ultimately the only way to make that enabled, or how to enable that, is really thinking about that from a different culture and mindset perspective. So we're actively thinking about and starting to think about that from a scenario planning, but almost a real in a context of, given these new conditions, how do I start to maybe even thinking and taking advantage of that? And it's really expanding those kinds of perspectives. But we're also doing that with a much more flexible and distributed workplace. And certainly in Canada, in my workplace, we've been, for the most part, in certain regions of Canada, been at home for the last 14 months. And working through that process, because it's just the way the way our public health system is dealing with that. So in certainly our context, whether it's in Canada or the US or even abroad, we're having to do a lot more via glass or via screens than we ever have had to previously. And it's been a matter of fact for our business for this period of time. So ultimately, we're learning and adapting, but certainly these changes have occurred in our business in a dramatic way over this time. So I think and I talked about culture as being one of the mindset, and I think so coming forward, I think and I've used these two figures, and I'm hoping there's some folks out there that recognize the guy on the right, a true Canadian, but it's certainly a true hero in a lot of ways. But I think the example here is when we think about a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset, is one of the key parameters, thinking about what that means from a cultural or in terms of bringing resilience to the forefront. And from a fixed mindset perspective, we're really, not that it's wrong, it's very objective based. We're actively focused and trying to achieve an objective at all costs. And the notion is starting to think of the realm of possibilities and potential. And certainly the perspective here, I think in the context of Captain Kirk on our right, is the perspective of understanding and adapting along the way. So our missions aren't necessarily as clear or as linear, but maybe somewhat more elliptical, or starting to think more adaptive in the context of, hey, I'm going to get there by a series of smaller objectives. So the notion is we're looking at how to become more agile in the context of how we'd approach digital transformation in broad strokes, but being resilient is similar in that we need to not only encounter and deal with each individual changes and adaptations to the market or to our environment, but start to bring them into how we're approaching and going into our ongoing challenges moving forward. So in a lot of ways, most organizations, or certainly a lot of organizations that I've talked to in terms of what I'd say from a digital transformation, or as they start to encounter and build towards during the course of the pandemic, has been how to experiment and think about how to look at key things that people can focus in on, or key organizations can focus on to ultimately move forward. And so in this case, it's let's start to hypothesize and use in some cases, the scientific method to actively look and see what's possible, and actively look and see if those things will work, or whether or not they're going to fail. And if they're going to fail, that's fine. Let's move forward faster and incorporate and make changes to that moving forward. Because I think what we're surrounded with is really a lot of change. And certainly I think if anything we've adapted to over the last year has been that context of, hey, there's a lot of ambiguity out there. There's certainly a lot of change. And so we have to embrace that and not necessarily get stuck by that. And certainly I think what we've seen across multiple industries and a couple of example companies that I worked with. Certainly, I think one of the we can't really talk about digital transformation without thinking about technology. Too often that becomes the core piece, but in a lot of cases it's certainly part of the strategy, and that we're linking and embracing technology right into in terms of strategy setting for the organization. But it's not the only piece. And what we're also seeing, and this is really a combination of the two, when we talk about that flexible workplace, really we're talking about the fluidity in the organizational structure. But in terms of how we tend to operate and come together for quick burst teams, and how we can do that in a really transparent, in a very fast way. But what's key is making more information available and creating that transparency at the same time. So we're seeing a lot more sharing. We're seeing a lot more technology to share and collaborate because we've had to. And I think the context is we can't just depend on running into people and having those kinds of conversations. We need to be much more intentional. So again, I'm going to walk through, I think, 3 case studies where I think this illustrates some of the challenges in terms of where organizations have adapted over the last little bit. The first I think is an example. We're working with a couple of clothing retail organizations in the U.S. And certainly the first perspective was we saw retail basically just fall off a cliff back in March of last year. And not surprisingly, we saw a lot of, in terms of a lot of these locations basically shut down or certainly be on pause. And the context being, well, how do we start to reopen? And certainly as some of that started to happen late last year, and certainly what we're seeing today is this whole notion of how do we start to frame and bring retail, or being able to offer retail offerings in a safe environment. So we've obviously taken advantage of e-commerce, curbside shopping, but the whole notion of actually being in the store. And so the whole real innovation here was really around how do we start to schedule and invite people to schedule appointments. And so this comes forward as really a real adaptation, because we're trying to figure out how to create a safe environment, but at the same time start to encourage and grow and continue to grow that business for folks that want to have that type of environment and that type of experience. And so the whole purpose here is pretty easy technology implementation, but the real change is now how do we start to change our operations to start to think about the constraints that means in terms of number of folks in a store, what that means in terms of returns, what that might mean in terms of the context of actually making sure that we have the appropriate stock in place. So certainly the real challenge here in starting to think about from a resilience perspective is how do we actually start thinking and making our business available for with these kinds of tools that essentially starts to enable that moving forward. Another example is a company I worked with in Toronto, and their focus was they were a car and truck rental firm, very localized, or at least geographically located in the greater metropolitan area around Toronto. And I think what's interesting about this one is obviously their competition is a lot of the majors. Think of Avis, think of Budget, Hertz, etc. And in the context here, and this is pre-pandemic, but the whole notion here was thinking about how Uber can essentially affect their business model in some pretty obvious ways. So the context here was really a business model innovation and thinking about this from a digital transformation perspective, but in knowing that Uber will have and has had an impact in their business, but to essentially establish a new business model, a new offering where they're offering where they're establishing more telematics-based equipment in their cars to actually provide a very much that Uber experience, so they're able to track all of their vehicles wherever they might be. But more importantly, they're able to provide hourly-based rentals and with a valet service, where they'll actually bring the car or truck to you. And this is basically focused on the very much a downtown perspective in Toronto, where it's very much, hey, I want to rent a car for a period of 3 hours to be able to do a major Costco run or a visit to IKEA. And so they built a model on this where they've essentially established a valet service and found a way to pay for that in the context of their rentals and membership fees that they would be charging to their clients and customers. So very much a novel take on the typical, hey, I'm going to go to the airport or another car rental agency and rent a car or a truck for the day or days. In this case, we're looking at an hour by hour basis, look at what the insurance implications would be behind that, and essentially create a whole new business structure and business model.
Why don't we get a little bit of input from the audience now that they've got a couple of your examples in their hands. Tammy, could we get one of the poll questions to come up?
Yep, you got it.
So if you could just take the chance to take a look here and use your polling tools on the panel to answer the question, we'd really appreciate that.
Yep, so coming out of the COVID pandemic, what are your organization's strategic priorities over the next 3 years? Select all that apply. Is it survival, improving the customer and employee experience, growth, minimizing business or compliance risk, or attracting new customers? And it looks like a number of you are all responding. We're pretty close. I'm gonna close it out and then show you the results, Tony.
So Sean, is this consistent with the types of things that you've been seeing through working with some of these customers?
Oh, for sure. I think and certainly I think you almost have a longitudinal view of things. Certainly I think early days, March, April, May of last year, the focus was on number one, or I guess on survival, sorry, in terms of the pink bar at the top. And in that sort of context was, how do we adapt and what are the types of things that we do? And so we supported a lot of clients, and the appointment application process was interesting because we've, folks or organizations or retail organizations that we were working with were very much trying to figure out how to shift away from well, in terms of being able to not only offer the e-commerce option and some of the curbside assistance, but to do that. I think as we continued to move, and I think this is what's maybe unique, or not unique, but certainly different between Canada and the US right now, is I think there's certainly some aspects around how do we think about minimizing business or compliance risk, but I think it's really about growth. And I think the US has in a lot of ways come out of this, and and I guess inconsistent with that in terms of just more recently economic data, that's certainly the case. We've seen the economic growth data on both Canada and the US lately that's actually focused on that recovery piece, which I think is key. So I think we're seeing now is the opportunities emerging to take share, to take advantage of the situation and say, okay, well, what can I do further? Because we've introduced new opportunities for things like contactless delivery, certainly contactless services that we're seeing more and more from organizations. So what else can we do? Because that's actually something that's changed dramatically.
That's interesting. It's interesting. We saw there kind of a resilient response in your last example, right? They shifted their business model. They adjusted to be able to. Oh, Sean wins a prize. He got the drink. They were able to adapt and maybe even grow. by doing that. And I noticed on that poll, the biggest line was actually people are shifting to growth, right? So maybe as you're talking through this next example, you can talk a little bit about that.
For sure. Although this one's probably more framed around efficiencies, but I think the perspective here was for an oil and gas energy utility. The perspective here was how to effectively look and learn from the data that they had. And I think one of the reasons why I brought it forward is they used that they viewed data as a key advantage in terms of their operational data to get a better sense of where things are at today. And so we always, I think we often hear, well, I need to see the data, or I want to make the evidence-based decision making. I hear that a lot, particularly in certainly around, we've seen that a lot with health and public health lately. But the notion here is how to apply that in an operational context. And in this case, we helped this organization develop what's called an AI factory. So it's in essence create algorithms and models based, in the cloud, because that's the latest cool tech and what have you. But essentially using this operational data with these algorithms to determine, hey, where are areas we can model and understand what some of the changes would be around and how we'd manage the infrastructure, what we're seeing in terms of demand, and get into more predictive ways to look at demand and see what impact that has on the not only supply, but in terms of how we operate the entire plant. In this case, we've been able to start modeling this and use, I guess what I'd say is the opportunity to keep learning and experimenting. And we're able to do this in an online context. So we're able to make those experiments prior to making some operational changes in how we're managing the pipelines or the infrastructure that's underlying a lot of the operations. So what I think the key thing here was using, in this case, it's a large scale example, but in a lot of ways, it's the ability for us to start thinking through and how to run experiments. And in this case, using an opportunity to manage multiple experiments to apply into an organization and say, hey, what if we do this? And I think that's probably the key. One of the most important questions is what if we did this? And using that as an opportunity to test something out. And in some cases, it doesn't have to be a big thing, but I think it opens up the potential for creating that transformation.
How would you describe your organization's current and planned progress towards digital transformation? Are you just beginning? Is there minimal progress, moderate progress, substantial progress, or are you completely transformed? All right, Tony, it looks like everybody has voted now, so let me close it out.
Not begun, minimal. Interesting. So no one's completely transformed. That's a good sign. That would mean that we're done. Not really moving forward. So I appreciate that's nice to see that people are still energized to move in that direction. How does this rate, Sean, with what you're seeing organizationally? That's an organization that helps customers do this.
Well, I think that's it's actually, I think, a pretty good representation of where I think where a lot of organizations are, and certainly it all depends on how you define, or how you or your organization defines digital transformation. In some ways, the context might be, and it'd be intriguing to know what some organizations are looking at from a moderate progress, like what types of initiatives are out there that they're working on. I think, and it might be useful to if some of those things might pop up in the chat if people are interested in sharing. I think where we're seeing is, I think the notion of how major is that digital transformation. I think in some ways it may be the implementation of a new ERP, or it might be around a new client or customer service initiative that's going to drive a really major impact to the business. It might be an omni-channel implementation of around e-commerce, or certainly something that we're trying to bring all the services back in, from whether it's call center or a portal or just even in person. So bringing those pieces together, I think might be driving some of that. And that certainly we've seen a slowdown in some of the major impacts, and we've certainly seen an exploration of cloud-based initiatives over the last 12 months, just because it's been easier to implement.
So I think it looks like you're going to tell us a little bit about how people may build digital resilience in their organizations.
Yeah, so I think in a lot of ways, and I probably should take a sip now, but from a building and examining from a digital resilience perspective, I think is a lot about building leadership and driving those the appropriate context to make transformation happen. I see a lot of similarities between the two. And largely part of that process is really around providing that vision and purpose. So establishing where you want to go in the direction that where you're headed. Because I think what's key in terms of bringing people together and coalescing around where you want to go is critically important. Otherwise, you'll forever be assuming you're going to be or maybe not even achieving that transformation objective that you're looking for. But more importantly, you're looking to how to adapt accordingly. One of the key contexts that we talked about earlier was we need to create those winning conditions for experimentation. So how do we create an opportunity to share and involve people, but also innovate and provide that sort of opportunity for that growth mindset to take place? And so it's what's going to be key for those opportunities is really getting people to operate differently, but also to think differently. So it's not necessarily thinking around, hey, there's in some ways it's what's that quarter end look like, but it's also about how we look incrementally between now and that quarter end to achieve that overall objective, which will be important. But even thinking about how we're going to do things, it will change our way of thinking. Or even operating, where we might get together now and form agile teams to work across boundaries, or think about how we come together and report on the status of projects or initiatives that we're working on a daily basis, and think about the time blocks that we look at, what we call sprints, and use that and borrow some I guess software development kind of lingo and language in terms of how we operate. So these are all aspects in terms of getting us to think about larger scale initiatives and projects into bite-sized chunks. And certainly they're project methodologies and opportunities that we've used for a number of years in the context of software development. But these are really key ideas for us to start building into how we want to achieve our own digital resilience and start to apply that kind of thinking into our environments today.
So you're really talking about, Sean, changing the way we work using that type of thinking.
Well, I think it's absolutely, yes. So I think it's absolutely critical for us to do that, in order to create that environment so that we can look at changes that come at us. So whether it's large scale disruption like COVID, or even smaller ones in terms of, hey, there's a new competitor in the marketplace, there's a new product that we're competing against, or a new entrant. We need to be thinking about them in those kind of contexts, and how do we start to operate more quickly and react more quickly. And really that's about thinking, operating, and looking and testing as key aspects to be able to build that resilience.
Cool.
So I wouldn't be a good consultant without introducing a model of some sort. So I've got a really busy slide here, but the notion here is that you can measure it. And measure that resiliency and maturity of how you operate, and these are I guess 8 different categories, and I won't spend all of our time going through this, but I think the overall context is thinking about digital and thinking about resilience. You're really thinking about what your vision and culture are all about, so thinking ahead and what your mindset's all about. Thinking about the capabilities that you bring to the table, whether it's your specific company or how you partner with other organizations. Certainly technology enters into the mix as well. And obviously, and maybe the more fundamental piece is how you operate as an organization. So what's in terms of the types of how your employees come together, what your processes are, how you operate from an organization. And so there's a bunch of these elements around the table in terms of whether that's strategy or platforms and infrastructure. I think the emphasis when we talk about transformation, it tends to be around platforms and infrastructure because, hey, that's easy. We'll just implement or sell you something, or you'll buy something that's based in the cloud. But I think the real value, if I can point that out, is around culture, leadership, and those capabilities. So and I think that's where, if there's time to be spent, is yes, certainly you need the technology to be successful, but without that leadership, without the aspect of understanding what you're trying to accomplish and those capabilities, really fundamentally is what drives that change and that resilience.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at this model that you've put up on the screen and realize that really 2 elements are focused on technology, while 6 others are actually focused on the rest of the business. Everything from what I might call tone at the top to like the way in which work is constructed for execution. And when you talk about processes and organization, I think you're talking about structure, right? Like, are people organized in a way that is consistent with being able to, I guess, in today's world, manage remote work, deal with manufacturing and other parts of various types of businesses. So I think you're almost saying the technology is not as important as the rest of the thinking.
Well, I'll say that all these elements are important, because I don't know if I would say that it's not as important. It's certainly important. What I think is the point I would make is that it's overemphasized. And in that context is, so you won't be successful without it, so it's still important. The reality is it often is the only thing that the organizations focus on. And I think that becomes that's where the gap is we don't consider that there's 6 other elements to think about. And the one that I think that most organizations tend to not we'll talk about change management as an opportunity to help organizations adjust to the change, whether it's a change of technology. But so that usually comes around to a lot of communications, lots of training, but not necessarily thinking about a change in mindset, or what do we need to do to change the culture around how it is we're operating. So if we're making a major change to a supply chain solution, well, that's one thing. I think there's a technology change, but if we're changing the way how we actually do our planning, or even if we're in terms of how we would actually roll that out, or actually how that gets even our plan, not the planning, but in terms of how we'd actually start thinking about the inputs into that, I think that's where we need to spend more and more time about where that's going to take us. And I think that's where we start to think about, oh, here's the other opportunities around this. So it's not just about, hey, we're just going to roll out the latest version of software, but start to think about what we want to do.
Yeah, you note customer experience up there on the top right of your model. That's interesting. Are you talking about personalization, or are you talking about like customer service?
Oh yeah, all of the above. I think I think in often cases, and I think we've talked about this for years, Tony, has been the whole notion that it is about that the overall customer experience is about all of the things that you just talked about. But too often, whenever we talked about, we'd see inconsistent experience between channels, whether it was online, on the phone, or in person. And I think the notion now, and I think what brought not my attention to it, but I think where it's become, I guess, crystallized for me has been just, with my teenagers at the time, and now they're in their early 20s, but the whole notion of smartphones and the experience and the expectation, probably more importantly, is that my daughter views her smartphone as, if I can't do it on my smartphone, I just don't care. And there's a problem with the organization if I can't do it on my smartphone. So whether it's a bank, whether it's the government, whether it's just shopping or sharing information with my friends. I can do all of those things from my smartphone. So when I encounter a crappy experience, and we see this today with mobile apps, if people will certainly delete a mobile app within an hour if they don't feel that that app actually does what they're expecting it to do, and if the experience is not what it is. So a lot of investment, and we've seen this particularly with marketing organizations, where they'll work through and make sure that digital experience is comparable or even superior to what their clients or customers might experience online or in person. So there's really fundamental. This is probably a significant growth area, and again, it gets enabled by platforms, but it also needs to be accompanied by that. If we're going to make a super big emphasis here, then we need to make sure that the culture of the organization supports it. And that's so it's simply, hey, it's not just a flashy new website or a new app, but it's we're changing how we're doing business as a result of it.
Yeah, interesting. I think the next poll question is probably timely here. So Tammy, could we bring that one on?
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so in which of the following ways do you expect automation and digital technologies to support your organization's business goals? Select all that apply. Is it increasing process efficiency by reducing error, risk, and cost? Increasing productivity through intelligent process automation? Increasing visibility into operations? Reducing overhead costs? Or improving the understanding of customer employee wants and needs? I'll give everybody some time there to make your selections. And Tony, we are starting to see some audience Q&A come through, so I can pose those to you and Sean as well.
Yeah, that'd be great, Tammy. Thank you.
All right, I'm closing out this poll.
Increased efficiency by reducing error, risk, and cost. Productivity through intelligent process automation and increased visibility into operations come out on top.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts, Sean?
Well, I think we look at ERP solutions or Excel. What are they? Excel replacement projects as a way to get a better insight into operations and reduce into looking at reduction of error. I think we're seeing is certainly a consolidation of systems, legacy systems, and moving and I guess modernizing those types of solutions as being a key requirement moving into the future. I think a lot of that was driven by how do we actually focus on the process piece, how we look at efficiency. Certainly that energy company I talked about was using advanced technologies like AI to look at their operational data to make significant changes. So I do think that's fundamental, and I think it's a great learning approach and certainly a good way to build some momentum in your organization for digital technologies.
Mm-hmm. A lot of the audience talked about error risk, and I think that probably meant repeatability. I can't remember the exact word, but certainly we'd be interested to hear what the audience is doing in that front. And Tammy, if you could share one or two of the audience questions.
Sure. There was one this last year. We have tried to implement more digital capabilities in our processes with COVID. Internally, people support these initiatives. How do you best work with suppliers and customers to comply with these changes? Some are small businesses, so they do not have the technology or support mechanisms to always comply with these changes.
So it's an interesting problem that I think many organizations face, that particularly organizations that deal with non-technology suppliers of goods and services or unique suppliers of goods and services. And I think one of the ways that organizations are conquering that today is by extending their enterprise. So extending their digital footprint to their suppliers, to the people who provide them services for more purposes than just billing or invoicing or ordering. So extending a platform so that their supplier participates with them as an organization using their platform. there are many organizations out there that are providing interconnected platforms, and others where a large organization is providing the interconnectivity by extending their platform. Are you seeing the same thing, Sean?
I'm seeing it a lot. It's interesting. I'm seeing it with professional services clients, where they're looking and establishing where it initially started off as a way to share billing and doing payments between organizations as a simpler way of doing that, and looking for those kind of efficiencies. I'm also seeing it now with interestingly, I'm going to call it collaboration, or a sort of a take on a tangential way to think about it from a collaboration perspective, where they've one organization I've been working with, they established a collaboration platform for their clients where they share information and advice, and so it becomes a sharing platform, not dissimilar to Reddit, although I wouldn't recommend Reddit unless you're into stock tips and stuff. But but it's an internally moderated platform for clients to basically seek out information, and they're moderated by my particular client, or they could be answered by other clients on the same platform. So it's created a knowledge base that other clients can take advantage of. So that's been one way to do that. So as you talked about the extended enterprise, that's certainly been an example out there. But I think where we're starting this, or I don't know if we're starting to see, but we're seeing more organizations being able to almost rent IP, and so essentially, whether it's white labeling solutions out there that they're able to offer to their customers. So I think that sort of context ends up, so you're able to kind of position yourself as, hey, I can't afford, or I choose not to pay or build my own sort of solution, but I may go out there and rent and I see this with construction companies a lot, where they'll rent a payment platform, a timesheeting platform from an external vendor, and so essentially they're able to be a lot more organized and professional, and therefore offer that to their other suppliers, and therefore provide a better service to their end customer.
Yeah, I mean, I think if there was more specificity in the question, we could maybe get into a little bit more detail on that. But as Sean said, this extension of the enterprise, even as simple as getting paid for services rendered for small organizations, to have that happen from larger organizations. Part of extending the enterprise might be accepting the request for payment and then digitizing it yourself, right, as part of your automation of your accounts payable process. Tammy, are there other questions?
Yes, there was another one that asked, what are some of the most common human barriers to change in the workplace?
I would say that traditional ways of doing business got turned on their head pretty rapidly as a result of the pandemic. And I think organizations changed rapidly to continue to survive and work well. And in some cases, traditional, let's talk about finance maybe. Finance, and traditionally, is a very reconciliation heavy part of an organization. It has been necessary for finance organizations to take a more systems accepted view of reconciliation, where technology is doing those reconciliations. I've been doing ERP for probably 30 years, and even with the greatest automation and the greatest digital processes supported, typically finance teams want to go and check transactions to ensure that that's true. And Sean, you work for an organization that part of the organization helps clients by doing that, checking the transactions. Or I think they call it vouching in the public accounting world, to ensure that they happened accurately. When we all know computers will make mistakes in a spectacular fashion in very large volumes, or once you get it right, they will do it right every time. So I think Sean's right. It is people that create the resistance, and it's really the common resistance to change that people have. They've done it one way for a very long time.
And Tony, the next poll question might shed some light on some of that as well. So let me go ahead and launch it. We're curious to know, where do you think you have the least progress on your digital transformation? Is it culture, leadership and capabilities, processes and operations, customer experience, data and information, or platforms and infrastructure? And just as we're waiting for the votes to come in, I saw another question in here that goes along with that response you just gave about people. How do you convince management to get on board with experimentation when they are risk adverse?
Well, that's a great question, and often so it's maybe the counterpunch to the typical approach to to selling anything in an organization is, oh, you need to have a business case for it. And the business case is usually a very thorough, look at that, 50-50. And so usually those business cases are, you spend a lot of time and effort around that, and notionally the whole, and so really getting away from that level of investment, is there a way to kind of test that hypothesis in a really small scale? And I think getting management on board is being able to say, okay, well, I ran this simulation or this experiment, or even in the digital, or in the digital world of online shopping, or even websites, you typically ran a test. You change something on the web page and seeing, okay, do I get a better response rate around one choice or another? And so really that experimentation is really getting you the opportunity to test something out really quickly, cheaply, to basically say, hey, this is something that may be worth doing, and building those kinds of, I'd say, even small business cases to kind of say, hey, this is an adjustment we've made. And I think and certainly I think with organizations that have a heavy online presence, that's something that's embraced very quickly. I think in an operational context, it gets a little bit more tricky, because, hey, do I take the whole line down for something like that, or can I run what is there a way for me to run that off as a small one-off experiment? And so it's seeing those kinds of progress, or being able to demonstrate those quick wins is really key to get the management on board.
Yeah, I think I don't know that I would add much to that, John, other than focus in on the inexpensive comment, right? Businesses run on margin and revenue and profit, and if you're impacting one of those pieces of telemetry as part of your experimentation, then you need to make a pretty good case for how to move forward. Or as Sean says, you do it on a very small scale, and don't impact those things finding a way to use unused time, or you separate it from the business completely independently. And you can read lots more about that if you look at things like the Innovator's Dilemma or Boring Brilliance as books that talk a great deal about processes to do that in a more meaningful way.
Any comments? Some of that feedback was nice and consistent with even the responses from this poll. But any other comments on kind of these areas that have the least amount of progress?
I sense there's a story on both those answers in terms of how people responded to that. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I led people down a garden track by saying that typically most people focus more on one and not the other, and you proved me wrong by making it equal. But I think the context here is, I believe there's probably scars on many of those answers, many of those folks answering those questions, because I do think in a lot of ways the technology may be the hard part. Often it's considered the easy part, and the people side ends up being the harder part. But I think they go hand in hand.
Great, we're coming close. We got about 6 minutes left. Sean, is there another slide that you'd like to go into? Is there anything you want to leave everyone with?
Yeah, there's probably, I'll just leave this with maybe a couple of what I'll call actionable steps with my Captain Kirk example here. But I think as to think about resilience and to move it forward is really to get a sense of where you're at as an organization in terms of determining where you are from a digital maturity, and what I'd say is digital IQ. Again, bringing forth that whole context of where you are or from a people perspective, and to look for those opportunities to create fresh thinking and innovation. Look for those opportunities to experiment and learn, because I do believe the small, even if they're small, the whole idea is that it becomes somewhat repeatable, and use those successes to drive change. And I think the cycle continues. So using this as an opportunity to kind of create those perspectives, I think will be immensely useful, and certainly lead to building a more resilient organization supporting digital transformation and your business overall.
I think we've got one more poll question around the opposite of the last question, and I think it would be good, Tammy, to leave us there. Where do you think we have the most progress on your digital transformation? Data and information hit top. Processes.
I'm shocked.
A little bit, yeah.
I think one of the nitty-gritty things, whether it's ERPs or any of the big systems, I think we discovered that the data is usually suspect as part of any migration effort. So it's intriguing that a lot of folks think that they've got great progress. So that's really great. That's really great that they've spent some time there. I'm hoping it's not a false positive, in that the context being, hey, we think we got great data, but we don't really know.
Yeah, I wonder whether, Sean, what we're seeing represented here is folks getting more data to be able to make decisions as a result of other transformation efforts. Because we are saying data and information, not just data, yeah?
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of truth there for sure.
Thanks, Tammy.
All right.
So some parting shots for everyone. The digital resilience is really about speed. And I think the pace of change has increased. I think what the pandemic was able to demonstrate to us was that we're all capable of it when the necessity arises. And so I guess two quotes here, one from the Facebook Little Red Book as they launched Facebook a few years ago, but certainly a comment from Reid Hoffman, one of the founders of LinkedIn, talking about the opportunity to actually think about this from a product innovation perspective, but more importantly, from our business perspective, is getting out there, finding ways to test and iterate and to build momentum is absolutely key. So I leave that with you as some parting shots related to digital resilience.
Thanks, Sean. Tammy, anything to close us off here?
No, just wanted to thank everyone for their time and appreciate everyone taking an hour out of your afternoon to join us. And we are having these online mixers as a digital transformation series to bring together different thought leaders across the industry to kind of help people on this journey. So thanks again for joining us, and stay tuned for our next one. Appreciate your time today, Sean. Thank you, Tony.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Tammy. Thanks, and everybody, have a great afternoon and a great evening.